Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy my stories. Today's episode is Fracture Rate by James Byron Love. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. Now let's get into this gritty sci-fi story. The airlock of the stellar International Lunar Outpost did not hiss. It groaned. Aging gaskets and hydraulic fatigue combined into a heavy, mechanical sigh that vibrated through the soles of the thick work boots worn by Ian MacDonald. Standing behind the yellow safety line, the maintenance man kept his hands buried in the pockets of a utility vest that smelled of machine oil and recycled sweat. The last three researchers shuffled into the transition chamber, their movements clumsy in the low gravity of the lunar environment. A woman named Jennifer, the lead botanist, turned back at the final second. Jennifer's face looked pale, shadowed by the harsh overhead lead strips. Weeks of breathing filtered air and staring at trays of experimental soy had left the woman with a frantic, hollow energy. "Ian MacDonald, do not forget the seal on rack 4 in the green room," Jennifer shouted. The botanist's voice was thin, strained by the adrenaline of departure. "It has been weeping since Tuesday. If the humidity drops, the crop is dead." A single nod was Ian's only response. A mask of professional indifference remained fixed on his face. While the man did not care about the soy, the integrity of the rack was a matter of mechanical pride. "I am on it, Jennifer. Go, get some real gravity." The controlled chaos of the rotation was reaching its final peak. Duffel bags and equipment cases were shoved into the cargo netting of the ship with a lack of ceremony that bordered on desperation. These people were not explorers. The staff consisted of corporate contractors, and the moon was nothing more than a high-pressure office they were finally allowed to leave. No long goodbyes followed. The outgoing crew gave Ian the kind of nods people give to a janitor, a mix of pity and dismissal. In the minds of those researchers, the man was simply part of the furniture, just another piece of base infrastructure that would remain behind when the airlock cycled shut. The atmosphere shifted when a man named Robert, the transport captain, stepped through the inner hatch. Robert looked at a data pad with a scowl that deepened the lines of a weathered face. "Change of plans," Robert announced. The captain's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Lunar tracking just flagged a high-density debris field. An asteroid storm. The leading edge is moving faster than the models predicted. We are moving departure up to 10 minutes ago. If you are not on the ship in 3 minutes, you are staying here for the duration." Relief swept through the researchers with an almost physical force. The crew stopped talking. Eyes no longer lingered on Ian. The group simply moved. The frantic scramble to board the transport was silent and efficient. Everyone was terrified of being trapped on the rock, even with the dome and its celebrated guarantees. To these people, the moon was a place where things broke and people died in the dark. Watching the hatch wheels spin, Ian heard the heavy metal teeth of the locking mechanism bite into place with a definitive thud. The lone maintenance man stood at the observation port of the upper dome as the rotation ship ignited its RCS thrusters. There was no sound in the vacuum, only a silent, shimmering expansion of gas that kicked up a veil of fine gray regolith. The ship rose, a utilitarian block of shielding and engines, shrinking into a speck of light against the oppressive blackness of the lunar sky. Then came the silence. It was not a true silence. A lunar base is a living thing, an artificial lung that never stops breathing. The distant, rhythmic thrum of the CO2 scrubbers provided a constant backdrop. A faint whistle of air moving through the ventilation ducts whispered through the halls. But it was the silence of absence. The base was designed for a dozen souls. When those souls left, the air seemed to lose its weight. Every metallic clink and every hum of a transformer became a heartbeat that Ian had to share alone. The isolation did not bother him. Reaching for a data pad, Ian began the post-departure checklist. The task was a ritual of grounding, a way to reclaim the space from the ghosts of the departed crew. Systems were nominal. Power levels held steady. The nuclear batteries were at 98%. Life support functioned perfectly. The oxygen mix was slightly rich, a side effect of the reduced biological load. Moving to the center of the dome, Ian's boots echoed with a hollow, metallic ring. This was the crown jewel of Stellar International, a vast, transparent hemisphere of polysilicate that served as the base's only protection. This was the guarantee. Marketing brochures described the structure as an indestructible shield, rated to withstand kinetic impacts that would pulverize a mountain. For nearly 30 years, the dome had stood without a single scratch. The man looked up. Earth was a marble of blue and white hanging in the void, partially eclipsed by the shadow of the base's superstructure. Below the planet, the lunar plain stretched out, a desolate graveyard of craters and ancient dust. Ian pulled up the storm tracking data. The storm was not a simple debris field. The event was a localized swarm of fast-moving silicate and nickel iron fragments. Projected impact density was high. Red dots on the display represented objects ranging from the size of pebbles to the size of houses. The rocks were moving at 20 kilometers per second. Rated for it, Ian MacDonald muttered. A calloused hand ran over the smooth, cold surface of one of the dome's interior supports. Engineering specs promised that the material would flex and dissipate energy. The polysilicate was supposed to be the ultimate solution to lunar habitation. The visual walk began shortly after. The trek was a 2-kilometer journey around the interior perimeter. Ian moved with a slow, deliberate gait, eyes scanning the silicate for any sign of stress. The search for the milky discoloration of microscopic fractures turned up nothing. Anchor points where the dome met the lunar regolith were checked and cleared. Everything was perfect. The dome was as clear and cold as the day the contractors installed it. The structure was a masterpiece of human arrogance. Satisfied, Ian began the descent into the underground sections. The actual living quarters were carved into the bedrock below the dome, a maze of prefabricated modules. As the man moved deeper, the silence became more oppressive. Lab modules sat empty, their centrifuges stilled and monitors dark. The hydroponics bay was equally desolate, where UV lights cast a sickly purple glow over rows of silent, genetically modified plants. In the cafeteria, Ian sat at the long table meant for the entire research team. A meal of rehydrated beef and gray, starchy potatoes had been prepared. The clink of a fork against the plastic tray was unnaturally loud in the empty room. Eating slowly, Ian kept his eyes fixed on the doors. The base was a masterclass in corporate cost-cutting. Because the dome was the primary pressure vessel, Stellar International had seen no reason to install heavy-duty bulkheads between the interior rooms. The doors were flimsy, lightweight things. The barriers were designed for privacy, not for survival. The entire facility was one continuous, pressurized environment. If the dome failed, there would be no compartmentalization. Air would not just leak. The atmosphere would be sucked out in a single, violent gasp. The base would be emptied like a lung punctured by a shard of glass. Ian imagined the executives in a boardroom on Earth, looking at a spreadsheet and crossing out the line item for pressure seals. There was no reason to pay for a second line of defense when the first one was guaranteed. This was an elegant piece of logic that only made sense if a person was not the one living inside the lung. The meal finished, Ian cleaned the tray with the meticulous care of a man who knew that a single stray crumb could foul a filtration unit. The bunk was the next destination. The quarters were small, a metal box that smelled of ozone and old books. Above the desk, 3 monitors displayed the base's vitals. One monitor was dedicated solely to the long-range radar. The storm front was moving in. First impacts were being recorded on the lunar far side. Seismic sensors were already picking up the vibrations, faint, ghostly tremors that traveled through the rock. Ian MacDonald lay down on the thin mattress. Fear was absent. In its place was the weight of the machine. As the only person left to maintain the illusion of safety, Ian set the monitors to a proximity alarm, a piercing shriek designed to wake a person the moment the first kinetic impact hit the sector. Closing his eyes, Ian waited for sleep. Outside in the airless dark, the rocks were coming. Inside, the man slept, listening to the steady, lonely rhythm of the pumps as the machines pushed air through the empty corridors. The base was a tomb waiting for a reason to open. Ian slept because the knowledge of the coming storm meant there would be no more rest once it arrived. He was a practical man, and a practical man knows how to husband his strength before the world begins to break. The hum of the bass became a low, comforting vibration in the marrow of his bones. A dream of rain on a tin roof followed, a sound Ian had not heard in years, a sound that implied an atmosphere thick enough to hold water and a sky that did not want to kill. This was the last moment of peace the maintenance man would have for a long time. Over his head, the great polysilicate eye of the dome stared blindly into the approaching chaos, waiting for the first pebble to strike. The proximity alert did not just sound. It screamed. A piercing 90-decibel shriek tore through the silence of the sleeping quarters, clawing Ian MacDonald out of a shallow dream of terrestrial rain. Adrenaline spiked through the man's system, a cold chemical rush that had his heart hammering against his ribs before his eyes were even fully open. The storm was early. Updated tracking had been a lie or a failure of the orbital sensors. It had accelerated, moving with a predatory speed that the models had failed to account for. Ian sat up, swinging heavy legs off the bunk. A quick swipe at the monitor above the desk brought the long-range radar into focus. The screen was a chaotic swarm of crimson dots, a digital hive of kinetic death already entering the lunar vicinity. The laid edge of the debris field was no longer a distant threat. It was a localized apocalypse. Standard protocol dictated a move to the deepest section of the underground facility. Ian did not waste time with shoes or a jacket. Moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew every weld and rivet of his environment, he stepped into the corridor. The air felt colder, though the environmental sensors claimed otherwise. It was the chill of a man who understood that his life was now being measured in kilometers per second and the thickness of a corporate-funded silicate shell. Reaching the lowest sublevel, Ian braced himself against the reinforced bulkhead of the primary server room. This was the most shielded spot in the base, buried under 20 meters of lunar basalt. The man sat on the floor, back against the cold metal, and waited. The first impacts arrived as distant thuds. They were not sounds in the traditional sense, as there was no air outside to carry them. Instead, they were vibrations, physical pulses transmitted through the ancient rock and into the structure. Ian felt them in the marrow of his bones. They got closer. The thuds evolved into rhythmic hammer blows that seemed to be trying to drive the base into the core of the moon. A sudden violent jolt shook the corridor, and for the first time in his 30-year career, Ian watched dust shake free from the ceiling panels. The sight of that fine gray powder drifting through the air chilled him more than the cold ever could. The base was designed to be static. If the bedrock was moving, the physics of the situation were reaching a breaking point. Checking the handheld data pad, Ian monitored the base's vitals. Power fluctuations flickered across the screen, minor surges as the grid compensated for the vibrations. Systems were holding. Life support remained nominal. But the impacts kept coming, more frequent and significantly larger than anything the tracking data had predicted. The guarantee was being hammered by objects the size of terrestrial houses hitting at full velocity. One impact struck with such ferocity that the entire world seemed to tilt. The floor bucked. Ian was thrown sideways, his shoulder slamming into the corridor wall. He caught himself, hands scrabbling for purchase on the smooth metal. Breath hissed through his teeth as he checked himself for injury. No broken bones. No blood. Only a dull, blooming ache in his arm and the terrifying realization that the dome was absorbing energy it was never meant to handle. The lights flickered, died, and plunged the corridor into a suffocating, absolute darkness. Emergency backup power kicked in 90 seconds later, bathing the space in a dim, sickly red glow. Ian sat in the crimson gloom, listening to the base groan. The metal was screaming as it twisted under the stress of the impacts. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hammering stopped. The silence that followed was different from the loneliness of the previous night. It was heavier, an expectant, suffocating quiet that felt like the breath held in a pair of punctured lungs. Ian did not move. He waited the standard 20 minutes, eyes fixed on the timer on his handheld, listening for any sign of a trailing debris field. Nothing. The moon had returned to its natural, indifferent state. Ian stood up, his joints popping in the silence. He began the ascent through the facility, moving up through the levels like a man climbing out of a grave. He checked systems at every terminal he passed. Power was restored to 100%. Life support was functioning. Most importantly, there were no pressure alarms. The seals held. The air remained where it belonged. Ian reached the surface level and stopped. Something was wrong. He couldn't identify the sensation immediately, but the very light in the dome felt fractured. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of polysilicate that had protected this outpost for 3 decades. There it was. A dark, jagged line ran nearly 3 meters across the surface, directly above the main elevator. It looked like a hair on a camera lens, but it was 3 meters of structural failure. Ian turned slowly, his boots crunching on the floor. His eyes tracked another line. Then another. Damage was everywhere. The clear silicate was webbed with fractures, some thin as spider silk, others wide enough to cast shadows on the floor. The maintenance man stood very still. He did not curse. He did not scream. He simply stared at the evidence of a lie. The guarantee had been tested, and the indestructible shield had lost. Methodical as always, Ian moved to the suit bay. He dressed in the bulky EVA suit with the practiced motions of a machine. He checked the oxygen levels. He tested the seals. He verified the suit camera was recording. Every action was a defense against the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm his practical mind. He cycled through the airlock, the sound of his own breathing loud in the helmet. Outside was worse. Under the harsh, unfiltered glare of the sun, the impact sites were visible. 4 of them were significant, great gouges in the silicate, where the surface around each crater radiated cracks outward like broken glass. In some places, the material had hazed over, turned milky by the sheer force of the kinetic energy. Ian walked the full exterior perimeter, stopping at each site. He studied the depth of the cracks, noting how they branched and tunneled into the lower layers of the dome. He took photographs, the shutter click of the suit camera, the only punctuation in the vacuum. The scale of the catastrophe became clear as he completed the circuit. This was not minor damage. This was not something that could be logged and patched during a routine maintenance schedule. The structural integrity of the dome had been compromised on a fundamental level. It was a dying lung, and the thermal cycles of the lunar day would soon begin to pull the wounds open. Ian went back inside. He cycled through the airlock, the hiss of repressurization sounding like a mocking laugh. He removed his suit piece by piece and sat down on the hard bench in the suit bay. He did not go to the comms. He did not call Earth. The maintenance man sat there for a long time, hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor. He was a man who fixed things. He was a man who solved problems. But as he looked at the suit he had just removed, Ian MacDonald realized he was sitting in a base that was effectively a ticking bomb, and the only thing between him and the void was a guarantee that had just expired. Finally, he stood up. He had a job to do. He went to start documenting the end of his world. Documenting the wreckage took 4 hours of grueling, mechanical repetition. Ian moved with a cold, rhythmic focus, refusing to let his mind drift toward the implications of what he was recording. Every fracture in the polysilicate was a data point. Every millimeter of separation was a variable in an equation that currently ended in his death. He worked with a handheld laser micrometer and a high-resolution camera, mapping the interior of the dome with the precision of a forensic investigator. The interior map was a spiderweb of red. Ian cross-referenced each internal stress line with the photographs he had taken of the exterior craters. The picture that emerged was catastrophic. 4 major impact sites served as the epicenters of the failure, but the damage was no longer localized. Cracks from different impact zones were beginning to reach for one another, intersecting in jagged junctions that signaled a complete breakdown of the dome's structural load-bearing capacity. The largest of the fractures ran nearly 6 meters across the zenith of the dome. At its widest point, Ian could see a visible gap, a sliver of dark void that seemed to be sucking the very light out of the room. It was a wound that refused to close. The math of the situation was even more ruthless than the silicate. Ian checked the base's orbital position. Sunlight was coming. On the moon, dawn was not a poetic event, it was a thermal assault. As the sun's unshielded rays hit the dome, the material would expand. The cracks would be worked like pliers, prying the structure apart. Then, when the base slipped back into the shadow of the peaks, the contraction would snap the material back. Every 14-day cycle was a hammer and an anvil, and Ian was the thing caught in the middle. A glance at the chronometer showed 3 hours until the first communication window with Stellar International opened. The physics of the orbital alignment were absolute. Until the satellites in the base were in the correct geometry, he was as isolated as a man on the far side of the galaxy. Ian utilized the waiting time to raid the supply lockers. He dragged every crate of repair material into the maintenance bay, his boots scuffing against the metal floor. One by one, he laid the items out in neat, grim rows. Suit batch compound, canisters of high-grade flexible sealant, bonding agents with varying cure times and flexibility ratings, rolls of high-tensile reinforcement tape. Everything spread out on the floor was of the highest quality. It was designed to save a life if a shard of rock pierced an astronaut's sleeve. But as Ian looked at the mountain of canisters and the vast, fractured sky above him, the gap between his resources and the reality of the task felt like a physical weight in his chest. He was trying to fix a cathedral with the contents of a first aid kit. Ian didn't allow himself to despair. He started at the base of the dome, choosing a small, non-critical hairline fracture for his experiments. He tried the standard application sequence, bonding agent, sealant, then a top layer of compound. The first attempt failed within 40 minutes. The material, designed to be applied in thin strips to fabric, reacted poorly when slathered onto the thick silicate. It cured too quickly, becoming brittle and snapping the moment the dome groaned. He adjusted. He tried a different layering method, using the reinforcement tape as a bridge between the bonding agent and the sealant. That failed better. It held for an hour before the edges began to curl and peel away like dead skin. On his 5th attempt, Ian found a rhythm. He applied a specific sequence of the slow-cure bonding agent, followed by a double weave of the high-tensile tape, and topped it with 3 thin, pressurized layers of soot compound. He watched it. He prodded it with a gloved finger. It didn't snap. It flexed. It gripped the silicate with a stubborn, desperate tenacity. It was workable. It wasn't a solution, it was a stay of execution. The comms console chirped, signaling the opening of the window. Ian climbed the ladder to the communication room and keyed the frequency. Stellar International, this is Ian McDonald. Outpost 656. Do you copy? The voice that returned was not the familiar, bored tone of the regular night shift operator. It was a man mid-20s by the sound of him, whose voice had the rehearsed, oily sheen of a corporate liaison. We copy you, Ian. This is Mark from Crisis Coordination. We've received your initial distress burst. How are you holding up? Ian didn't answer the personal question. He gave the report he had spent hours preparing. 4 major impact sites. Multiple primary and secondary fractures. The largest crack is over 6 meters. Intersecting stress lines are compromising the entire surface. Thermal cycling begins in 4 hours. The repair materials on site are insufficient for a permanent fix. Mark from Crisis Coordination paused. Could you repeat that last part, Ian? The bit about the crack measurements. Ian repeated it. He spoke slower this time, his voice flat and hard. He detailed the width of the gap at the zenith. He explained the math of the expansion. He gave them the reality, unvarnished and brutal. There was a long silence on the other end. Then a new voice cut in. This one was older, deeper, and carried the practiced weight of a man who spent his life protecting a bottom line. Mr. McDonald, this is Director William. We've reviewed the footage you've been uploading. We are deeply concerned about the asset. Tell me, do you have the original installation and integrity documentation for the dome on site? We need to verify the warranty specifications. The question felt like a slap in the face. Ian leaned into the console, his knuckles white. I have the documents, Director. They are on file, but we are past warranties. I need to know about the rescue ship. When is it launching? Director Williams' voice didn't waver. We are evaluating all logistical options, Mr. McDonald. It's a complex situation given the ongoing debris field in the orbital path. For now, your priority is to continue documenting the damage. Every measurement is vital for our legal team and the manufacturers. When is the ship coming? Ian asked again. He didn't raise his voice, he just made it sharper. We are working on the timeline. We will have a more comprehensive update at the next window. Sit tight, Ian. You're doing a great job. The director hesitated for a fraction of a second when Ian asked if the dome manufacturer had been contacted. Yes, all relevant parties are being notified, William replied smoothly. The window closed. The static returned, filling the small room with the sound of a dead universe. Ian sat in the dark for a long minute, replaying the conversation. He recognized the tone. It was the sound of a company protecting its legal position before it protected its people. They didn't want to save him, they wanted a paper trail that proved the dome had failed its guarantee. The maintenance man stood up, his face set in a hard, grim line. He didn't go back to his bunk. He didn't wait for the next window. He walked back to the maintenance bay and picked up the canisters of bonding agent and the rolls of tape. Ian McDonald climbed the ladder to the surface level, heading toward the 6-meter track at the top of the world. He had 2 hours until sunrise, and he was the only one who was going to try to keep the air inside the base. He began to work, his movements precise and small against the vast, breaking sky. Ian climbed the rungs of the maintenance ladder with a heavy, rhythmic deliberation. He had rigged the aluminum structure to the interior tracks of the dome, creating a precarious, mobile platform that allowed him to reach the apex. 6 meters of jagged silicate hung directly over his head. From this height, the crack looked like a canyon. At its widest point, the gap was a raw, translucent edge that seemed to pulse with the cold vacuum on the other side. The application process was a brutal test of patience. Ian spent the first hour prepping the surface, using a pressurized air wand to clear microscopic regolith dust from the fracture lines. Any impurity would compromise the bond. He applied the bonding agent with a hand spatula, his arm muscles burning as he worked the thick, gray sludge into the jagged teeth of the crack. He didn't rush. He knew the cure rates by heart now. A bad patch was a death sentence disguised as a solution. It would give a false sense of security until the pressure differential turned it into a projectile. The curve of the dome made every movement a struggle against physics. To reach the highest point of the fracture, Ian had to lean out over the safety rail, his boots braced against the lower rungs. Working at these awkward angles forced him to use his non-dominant hand to steady the reinforcement tape while he smoothed it down with the other. The tape was stubborn, designed to grip suit fabric, and it fought the smooth silicate. Ian gritted his teeth, his breath fogging the lower edge of his safety glasses as he fought to keep the line straight. After 4 hours of uninterrupted labor, the first major crack was encased in a thick, ugly ridge of gray compound. It looked like a surgical scar on a giant's eye. Ian climbed down, his knees popping as his boots hit the reinforced floor. He stepped back and examined the work. It was crude, lacking the seamless finish of factory-sealed silicate, but it was solid. When he pressed a gloved hand against the base of the patch, he felt the stubborn resistance of a bond that had taken hold. He didn't allow himself a moment of pride. He moved the ladder toward the second largest crack and began the process again. While his hands performed the familiar dance of prep and seal, Ian's mind was outside. He knew that an interior patch was only half the battle. To truly stabilize the dome, he needed to create a compression seal on the exterior surface. But the exterior was a different world. Out there, he would be alone in a suit, tethered to a structure that was actively trying to shed its skin. There was no backup. If a patch failed or a crack snapped while he was standing on it, there would be no one to drag him back to the airlock. He decided to finish the interior first. He would secure the lung from the inside before he stepped into the void. Halfway through the second crack, the thermal cycle hit. A low, resonant creak echoed through the facility. It was a sound Ian had never heard in 30 years. The sound of 40,000 tons of polysilicate expanding under the sudden, unshielded heat of the sun. The dome groaned like a dying ship. Ian froze on the ladder, his hand hovering over the bonding agent. He turned his head toward the first patch. The 6-meter scar moved. It flexed, the gray compound stretching as the silicate pulled apart. Ian held his breath, watching the edges of the tape. The bond held. The material groaned, but the patch stayed seated, absorbing the expansion. He let out a long, slow exhale that rattled in his chest and turned back to the second crack. He worked faster now, the heat radiating through the dome and beginning to bake the air in the upper levels. By the time the next communication window opened, Ian had finished the second impact site. He climbed down to the comms room, his hands trembling slightly from the constant isometric strain. The voice of Director William was joined by 2 others. "Mr. McDonald, we have someone from the manufacturer on the line," William said. His voice was even more formal than before. "This is Dr. Aris from the technical division." Dr. Aris didn't offer pleasantries. The man's voice was sharp, clinical, and rapid fire. "I've seen the images, Ian. Are the fractures through cracks or surface grazing? What is the orientation relative to the primary anchor points? Is there any localized frosting at the tips?" Ian answered precisely. He gave the measurements in millimeters. He described the orientation of the intersecting lines. He told them about the width of the gap at the zenith. As he spoke, he heard the faint, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard on the other end. He knew what they were doing. They weren't just helping him, they were building a forensic record. They were measuring the failure against the liability clauses in their contracts. The third voice, a woman who had not identified herself, remained silent. Ian could feel her presence, a legal shadow hovering over the technical data. Dr. Aris began giving advice on layering techniques. Much of it was theoretical garbage, methods that required specialized heat lamps and vacuum presses Ian didn't have. But a few points on the chemical curing of the bonding agent were useful. Ian took notes on the back of a diagnostic sheet, his pen scratching against the paper. "What are you using for the bridge?" "Where is ours?" "Suit patch compound and high-tensile tape," Ian replied. There was a pause. A muffled sound came through the speaker, the sound of a hand being placed over a microphone, but not quite sealing it. Ian caught fragments of a conversation. A limited liability. Documented attempt. Field improvisation. The technical voice came back. "Your approach is reasonable, Ian. Given the inventory, it is likely the best course of action. Continue the work. Document every application." Ian didn't care about the documentation. "Director, about the ship. Give me a launch date." Director William sighed, a sound of practiced corporate fatigue. We have authorized the prep of a rescue vessel, Ian. We are looking at a timeline of approximately 2 weeks. Ian's eyes went to the monitor. 2 weeks, 14 days, 28 thermal cycles. He did the math against his remaining canisters of sealant. He did the math against the rate of crack propagation he had seen during the last hour. The numbers didn't add up. They didn't even come close. 2 weeks, Ian repeated. He didn't tell them they were sentencing him to death. He didn't tell them the dome would be a shattered skeleton by day 10. Confirming, Director Williams said. 2 weeks, possibly sooner if the orbital debris clears faster than predicted. Ian thanked them and closed the window. The static returned. He sat in the chair for 5 minutes, staring at the blank screen, then stood up and went back to the third track. He worked through his next sleep cycle. Time became a blurred sequence of gray sludge and silver tape. He stopped only when his fingers began to cramp into claws, shaking so violently that he could no longer apply the compound in a smooth layer. He retreated to his bunk, slept for 4 hours of fitful, dark dreams, and got back up. By the end of the 3rd day, the interior was done. All 4 impact sites and the major radiating lines were covered in the gray, industrial scarring. The dome looked like a map of a broken country. Ian stood on the floor of the surface level, head tilted back, looking up at his work. It was crude, it was ugly, and for the moment it was holding. The next morning, Ian suited up for the exterior. Working outside was a different kind of hell. The maintenance handholds built into the dome's surface were designed for quick inspections, not for hours of structural repair. In the vacuum, Ian's suit was a pressurized prison. The thick, multi-layered gloves reduced his dexterity to a clumsy fumbling, making the delicate application of the bonding agent almost impossible. He had to wedge his feet into the handholds and lean back into the void, using one arm to anchor himself while the other worked the spatula. Every movement required a conscious effort of will. The sun beat down on his back, the suit's cooling system whining as it struggled to dump the heat, while the side of him facing the dome remained in freezing shadow. The exterior patches went on slower. He applied them thicker, compensating for his lack of precision with sheer volume. He worked until the low oxygen alarm in his helmet began to chime, a persistent, melodic warning that forced him back to the airlock. He came inside, recharged the tanks, ate a tasteless protein bar, and went back out. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon and the exterior work was complete, Ian was hollowed out. It was a level of exhaustion that went beyond the muscles and the bone. It was the weariness of a man who had spent 72 hours playing a game of chess against physics with his life as the only wager. Ian dragged himself through the airlock, stripped off the suit, and didn't even bother to put it away. He logged the final exterior photographs, forced himself to swallow a cup of lukewarm coffee, and fell onto his bunk. He was asleep before his head hit the pillow, the sound of the pumps still humming in his ears like a promise that he hadn't broken yet. Ian MacDonald woke to the sound of his own pulse. It was the first thing he felt every morning now, a steady, internal thud that reminded him he was still breathing the same air he had been breathing for 8 days. He didn't linger in the bunk. The routine was his only defense against the crushing weight of the silence, and the first step of that routine was the walk. He climbed to the surface level and began the trek along the interior perimeter of the dome. Ian kept his eyes fixed on the silicate, his gaze tracking every gray scar he had applied. Most of the patches were holding, but as he reached the 3rd impact site, he stopped. 2 of the patches showed faint, white stress marks blooming at their edges. The material was being worked by the relentless thermal cycling, expanding in the glare, snapping back in the dark. The silicate was fighting the bond. Ian methodically photographed the stress marks, the shutter click of the camera sounding like a gunshot in the empty dome. He added the images to his log, which had grown into a massive, data-heavy document of structural decay. He checked the exterior patches through the translucent surface, squinting against the harsh lunar glare. From this angle they looked solid, but the refraction of the thick silicate made it impossible to be certain. He needed to be closer. The process of suiting up was now as natural as breathing. Ian ran his checks with mechanical speed, cycled through the airlock, and stepped onto the lunar regolith. Outside, the sun was a white-hot eye in a black sky. He made his way to the second impact site, his boots kicking up clouds of fine, static-charged dust. He found the failure immediately. One of the exterior patches had developed a lift at its southern edge. The bonding agent had failed to grip the silicate during the last expansion cycle, leaving a millimeter-wide gap where the vacuum began to claw at the sealant. Working in the suit was a slow, clumsy nightmare. Ian had to apply fresh bonding agent, his thick fingers struggling with the spatula, and then press a strip of reinforcement tape over the lift. He had to hold it there, his gloved hand trembling with the effort of maintaining constant pressure while the bond set. In the vacuum, time seemed to stretch, measured only by the rasp of his own breath in the helmet. Finally, the tape took hold. He checked the other sides. They were stressed, the surfaces showing a slight, rhythmic waviness that told him the dome was still moving beneath his feet, but they were not yet failing. Back inside, Ian sat at the scarred metal table in the maintenance bay. He laid out his remaining inventory, canisters of sealant, rolls of tape, bags of compound. He did a hard accounting, his pen scratching across the paper as he subtracted his latest repairs from the totals. The numbers were not good, but they were not yet critical. If his technique stayed efficient and the cracking didn't accelerate, he had enough material to maintain the status quo for another week. Maybe 10 days. It was a thin margin, a life preserver made of gray sludge and tape, but it was all he had. The communication window opened with a sharp chirp. This time the manufacturer's technical voice, Dr.As, was the first to speak. "Transmit your complete log data immediately, Ian. We need the latest strain measurements." Ian hit the transmit key and waited. The silence on the other end lasted for 10 minutes. When As returned, the voice was clipped. "We flagged 2 of your primary patches as under-reinforced at the margins. The thermal expansion is concentrating stress on the bonding points. You need to strip the outer layers and reapply using a crosshatch pattern with the reinforcement tape. It will improve the edge bonding by 30%. Ian listened, his jaw tight. It was useful information, delivered with the cold precision of a company trying to ensure their advice was followed for the sake of their own legal defense. He didn't care about the motive. If it kept the dome together, he would do it. Director Williams' voice cut in next. "Ian, the rescue situation is progressing. We have some logistical complications regarding crew certification for the lunar approach, but we are working through them." "What complications?" Ian asked. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "The specific crew required for this docking maneuver is currently finishing a high-orbit rotation," Williams said. "We need to ensure they meet the regulatory rest requirements before we can clear them for the mission." "How long?" "We hope to have clarity on the launch window at the next window." "Sit tight." Ian noted the change. The last delay had been about the debris field. Now it was crew certification. He didn't argue. He didn't plug. He just filed the lie away with the others and closed the connection. Implementing the new technique was a grueling task. It required Ian to partially remove the material he had already applied, scraping away the cured compound with a vibrating multi-tool. It cost him hours of labor and materials he hadn't budgeted for, but the logic of the crosshatch was sound. He worked through the afternoon and into the artificial evening, the base lights dimming as the system moved into its night cycle. Ian established a routine and taped it to the wall of his quarters. Wake. Interior chat. Exterior chat. Log. Late up. Work patches. Comms. Work patches. Late up. Log. Sleep. The routine was the only thing keeping the madness of his isolation at bay. If he had a job, he was a maintenance man. If he was a maintenance man, he wasn't a ghost in a glass tomb. He followed the list with religious devotion, his life shrinking down to the tip of a spatula and the edge of a roll of tape. Over the next several days, the patches held. The cracking stabilized, the rate of propagation slowing enough that his twice-daily measurements showed only marginal changes. For the first time since the storm, Ian allowed himself a small, carefully guarded sense of hope. He was winning. He was holding the line. The communication windows continued their hollow pattern. Stellar provided vague reassurances, Ares provided technical critiques, the silent legal shadow watched it all. Ian asked for an ETA in every single window. He never got one. On day 8, the hope died. Ian was doing his morning walk when he saw it. A new crack had appeared, but it wasn't near the impact sites. It was a meter-long jagged line in a previously clean section of the dome, positioned between two of his most reinforced patches. Ian stood in front of it, his heart sinking into his gut. This wasn't a propagation crack. This was a stress fracture. The dome was no longer breaking because of the rocks. It was breaking because the structural load of the entire hemisphere was shifting. The pressure was moving through the silicate, hunting for a weak point, and it had found one. This was a systemic failure. He patched it, his movements automatic, but he stood looking at the new scar for a long time after the bond had set. That night Ian lay awake in his bunk, staring at the dark ceiling. The math was running in his head again, but the variables had changed. The materials were dwindling. The cracks were spreading. The thermal cycles were getting more violent as the sun climbed higher. And the rescue ship was still a ghost in a corporate spreadsheet. He got up at 3 in the morning, unable to remain still. He made a pot of black, bitter coffee and sat in the empty cafeteria. The silence of the base, built for 12 people and now containing only one, felt like a physical pressure against his ears. He drank the coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty chairs where Jennifer and Robert and the others should have been sitting. When the cup was empty, Ian went back to his bunk. He lay down and forced himself to close his eyes. He slept because sleep was part of the routine. The routine was the job. And the job was the only thing that kept Ian MacDonald from realizing that he was already dead. A sound that shouldn't exist pulled the man from a shallow sleep on the 9th day. It was not the rhythmic thrum of the scrubbers or the distant whistle of the ventilation. It was a frequency, a low-register vibration that sat in the back of the throat and rattled the water in a bedside glass. This was the sound of a structural groan that had finally found its resonance. Ian went up to the surface level fast. The maintenance man skipped the morning coffee and the ritualistic log entry, propelled by a cold instinct sharpened by a week of living inside a failing machine. The source revealed itself at the first impact site, the location of his earliest, most confident repair. The 6-meter scar was dying. The patch material itself, the high-grade gray compound layered with such meticulous care, was webbed with new fractures. Thermal cycling had finally fatigued the compound beyond its elastic limit. It was no longer absorbing the dome's movement, it was shattering under it. Ian moved closer, boots silent on the floor as he knelt to inspect the downhill edge. Gravity combined with the relentless expansion of the silicate had pried the bond open. There was a visible lift, a lip of gray material that had peeled away from the dome, leaving the raw crack beneath exposed to the pressure. Panic is a luxury for those who do not understand the mechanics of their own death. Ian did not feel it. Instead, a grim, familiar clarity took hold. He hauled the ladder over, the metal clanging against the tracks, and began an emergency repair. He worked with a frantic precision, stripping away the brittle, failed layers of the old patch and preparing the surface for a fresh application. A rush job would fail faster than the original, so the man forced his hands to remain steady while reapplying the bonding agent, layering the reinforcement tape in the crosshatch pattern Ares had suggested. 2 other patches nearby showed the same symptoms, the telltale whitening at the edges that signaled a bond about to snap. They were not failing yet, but they were telling Ian exactly when they would. The emergency repair on the first site was finished within the hour. Ian stepped back, wiping grease and sealant onto a rag. The new patch was thicker, uglier, and lacked the uniform grace of the first attempt. He did not trust it. Nothing made of tape and glue could be trusted when the opponent was the cold, expanding physics of the moon. Moving to the two secondary sites, he burned through a significant portion of the daily material allocation to reinforce the edges. The inventory was shrinking. He was spending his survival on a holding action, and the realization made his chest tighten. The morning perimeter walk brought the killing blow. In a section of the dome that had been pristine only 24 hours ago, a new crack had appeared. It ran nearly 2 meters, a jagged lightning bolt of white silicate. Beside it sat a hairline fracture that had not been in the previous day's photographs. Ian stood in front of it, the laser micrometer heavy in a calloused hand. The dome was now generating new damage faster than the man could repair the old. Structural integrity was compromised beyond the impact sites. This was no longer about the asteroid storm, it was about the fundamental stability of the entire hemisphere. The dome was finding its own new failure points as the stress redistributed itself through the silicate. It was a dying organism trying to settle into a shape that would allow it to shatter completely. Ian patched the new crack and photographed the hairline fracture. Every movement was mechanical, a series of practiced motions that kept his mind from dwelling on the geometry of the failure. He logged the data with the precision of an undertaker. The communication window opened, and Ian did not wait for the corporate script to begin. "The situation has changed," he stated, his voice flat and cutting across the opening static. "Damage is no longer confined to the impact sites. New cracking is appearing in undamaged sections. My patch materials are showing fatigue failure. I need a firm date on the rescue ship right now." A longer pause than usual followed before the senior stellar voice responded. The tone was careful, measured, and utterly devoid of substance. "We are working on it, Ian. There have been some additional complications. We want to assure you that your situation is the priority." "What complications?" Ian asked. The stellar voice mentioned launch window calculations and fuel load requirements for a faster transit. Apparently, a faster ship costs significantly more to operate, and there are approvals required. The maintenance man absorbed the information in silence. The speed of his rescue was a line item in a budget meeting. Somewhere on Earth, people in suits were weighing the cost of fuel against the cost of his life and the loss of the asset. "Is there any structural intervention beyond patching I should be considering?" Ian asked, turning his attention to the manufacturer's technical voice. He described the new crack locations in exhaustive detail. A muffled conversation played out in the background of the call. The technical voice eventually returned, hushed and strained. "The new fractures suggest the dome is experiencing sympathetic fracturing. Stress redistribution through the entire structure." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Ian pressed. "It means the dome is looking for new failure points," the voice replied. "It will continue to do so as the thermal cycling continues." "How long does the dome have?" "That depends on variables we cannot calculate from Earth without more data." "I will get you the data," Ian said, and he closed the window. The rest of the day was spent in a fever of documentation. Ian conducted the most thorough damage assessment since the storm hit. He measured every crack, every patch, and every new fracture, building a complete, updated map of the base's mortality. He transmitted the file to Stellar at the evening window, without a single word of commentary. A new voice answered the evening call. This man identified himself as a logistics coordinator. "A ship is being prepared, Ian. We are looking at departure within the next 4 to 5 days." "Name?" Ian asked. "The crest line out of the lunar transfer station." Ian wrote the name down. It was the first concrete detail he had been given. "Transit time once departed. Approximately 9 to 10 days depending on trajectory," the coordinator said. The math was simple and devastating. 5 days to departure plus 10 days of transit. Rescue was at minimum 15 days away. Ian looked at the crates of sealant and the data on the screen. 15 days was a lifetime the dome did not have. The man thanked the coordinator and closed the channel. He sat in the communications room for a long time after the light on the console went dark. The silence of the base felt heavier than the lunar crust above him. Eventually, Ian stood up. He walked to the rover bay and stood in the doorway. Two rovers sat parked in the dim work lighting, their rugged tires coated in the dust of better days. He stood there for several minutes, looking at the machines but making no move to enter. Back in the quarters, Ian updated the log and ate a meal of lukewarm protein and starch. He did not taste any of it. He went to sleep because the routine was the only thing left that functioned. He slept because a maintenance man with shaking hands was a man who had already given up. Bad news waited for the man at the top of the ladder on day 10. The emergency repair on the first impact site, the thick, ugly scar he had labored over only yesterday, was already showing signs of distress. Faint white stress lines webbed the surface of the new compound. Because the repair material had been applied over the remains of the original patch rather than bare, clean silicate, the bond was compromised from the start. The thermal movement of the dome was tearing the patch apart from the inside out. Ian spent the next 3 hours reinforcing what he could, fighting a desperate holding action against the physics of expansion. When the last of the morning repairs was set, the maintenance man climbed down and stood in the center of the dome floor. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the entire interior surface. The structure looked like a wounded thing. It was a crude, ugly record of 11 days spent fighting a losing battle with the wrong tools. Patches were layered upon patches, reinforcement tape crossed over old, peeling strips in a chaotic grid of desperation. The guarantee was gone, replaced by a monument to industrial improvisation that seemed to groan under the weight of its own failure. Ian retreated underground. He sat at the long plastic table in the empty cafeteria with a cup of bitter coffee and a notepad. It was time for the accounting he had been avoiding, the cold, honest math of survival. He began to list the facts with the same precision he used for a technical manual. Materials remaining. He counted every canister of sealant, every roll of tape, every tube of bonding agent. He recorded the current quantities, refusing to use optimistic estimates. Crack progression rate. Using his log data, he calculated the average daily growth across all active fractures. The numbers were trending upward. Patch failure rate. He calculated how many patches had required secondary or tertiary repair and the interval between those failures. Days of effective repair capacity remaining. Ian performed this calculation 3 times. He did not like the answer the first 2 times, so he rechecked the variables, hoping for a carryover error. The result remained the same. He had perhaps 4 to 5 days of effective patching capacity left before the rate of damage outpaced his ability to address it. Beyond that point, the dome would be failing faster than he could move, and he would have nothing left to move with. The man sat with that number for a long time. He watched the steam rise from his coffee until the cup went cold. Then he finished the drink, washed the cup, and put it away in its designated rack. Ian walked to the rover bay. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the 2 standard lunar exploration vehicles. They were rugged, pressurized machines designed for multi-day surface excursions with a crew of 4. Ian climbed into the nearest rover and opened the supply manifest on the onboard system. He read through the list: emergency supplies, oxygen canisters, water, ration packs, medical kit. Everything was within its service date. Checking the power systems, he confirmed that both rovers were fully charged and the solar arrays were functional. He moved to the life support systems. The filters were clean and the seals were tight. He knew this for a fact because he had serviced them himself 3 weeks ago as part of his standard rotation. Ian began to calculate a new set of variables. One rover running conservatively with a single occupant could sustain life support for approximately 8 to 10 days beyond its rated capacity if supplemented with additional supplies from the base. That was 8 to 10 extra days on top of whatever time the dome gave him. The decision was not made out loud. He didn't write it down. Instead, he began moving supplies into the bay. He worked with a steady, purposeful gait, transporting oxygen canisters, ration packs, and supplementary water containers from the storage lockers. To any camera watching, it could be interpreted as routine inventory management. He stacked the supplies neatly near the rover, but did not load them yet, maintaining the ambiguity of the task even in his own mind. When the communication window opened, Ian said nothing about the rover bay. The logistics coordinator returned with an update that felt like a physical blow. The Crestland departure had been pushed back by another 2 days. The coordinator cited a crew availability issue. Ian lined into the microphone. "Are the crew certification problem and the availability issue related?" "I don't have that information," the coordinator replied, his voice tinny and distant. Ian asked for the new departure date and wrote it on his notepad. He performed the final calculation. The gap between his material capacity and the earliest possible rescue was now 4 days. 4 days where the dome would be open to the void and the rescue ship would still be in transit. 4 days of nothing. The technical voice of Dr. Aris came on next, asking for the updated damage report. Ian gave it completely, the measurements, the failure rates, and the dwindling inventory. A muffled, hurried conversation played out in the background before Aris returned. "Ian, have you considered concentrating your remaining repair efforts on the most structurally critical sections? We suggest abandoning full dome coverage." "Which sections do you consider critical?" Ian asked. The technical voice described the 4 quadrants surrounding the original impact sites. The logic was sound. Those zones handled the primary structural load. If those held, the dome might remain upright even as the rest of the silicate shattered. "What happens to the abandoned sections?" Ian pressed. "They will continue to crack," Aris admitted. "But the dome may hold longer overall if the critical sections are maintained." Ian understood the weight of that "may." It was the language of a man who was out of better options. He thanked them and closed the window. The rest of the day was spent in retreat. It felt like a defeat, but Ian implemented the new strategy. He abandoned 3 sections of less critical patching, focusing his remaining materials on the 4 primary structural zones. He worked with a grim intensity, reinforcing the critical quadrants while ignoring the new spiderwebs forming elsewhere. That evening, the man returned to the rover bay. The ambiguity was gone now. He began loading the additional supplies into the rear storage compartment of the rover. He worked methodically, checking and double-checking the life support, the power, and the navigation. He tested the rover's independent communication system. It was a weaker signal than the base array, but it could reach Earth on the emergency frequency. It was a lifeboat. Ian closed the rover up and parked it facing the exit airlock. He returned to his quarters and updated the log with the day's structural work, intentionally omitting any mention of the vehicle. He followed his routine, ate his meal, and went to sleep. The gap in the math was still there, 4 days of empty space, but he had found a way to bridge it with a machine of his own making. The frequency was the first thing to betray the structure. Ian did not wake to an alarm or a siren. Instead, the vibration in his bunk shifted from a familiar mechanical hum into something organic and wrong. A deeper and more present resonance took hold. It was a low-frequency groan that felt like it was being generated by the lunar bedrock itself. For a man who had spent 43 years listening to the stress of materials, the sound bypassed the brain and went straight to the marrow. The elasticity was gone. The dome was no longer resisting the pressure. It was merely enduring it. Less than 2 minutes passed before Ian was out of his quarters and moving toward the ladder. When the lights in the dome bay flickered to life, the reality of the night hit him. A cascade event was the term he would later use in his log, but in the moment the scene looked like a battlefield. Multiple failures occurred simultaneously in the non-critical sections, he had abandoned just the day before. These were the areas where patching had stopped to save the remaining compound. The thermal contraction of the lunar night had worked the unsupported tracks like a crowbar. The damage was no longer microscopic. Calipers were not needed to measure the propagation. Across the dark expanse of the abandoned quadrants, the cracks had widened into jagged, invisible gaps. What had been hairlines yesterday were now black veins pulsing against the gray silicate. The perimeter walk began with a heavy and methodical pace. Every discovery was counted out loud to keep the mind focused. 7 new significant track developments appeared in the first sweep. 4 major patch failures occurred where the sealant had simply given up and delaminated from the surface. In 2 specific areas, multiple fractures intersected in a spiderweb pattern. This effectively isolated large islands of the dome material. These sections were now structurally independent and held in place by nothing but the desperate tension of the neighboring quadrants. Every failure was photographed and every coordinate was logged. The engineering truth was already clear. By abandoning those sections to save the core, the damage was allowed to accelerate in a way that now threatened the entire structure. The unmanaged zones were physically pulling on the managed ones. This created massive and unforeseen stress loads at the boundaries. A move to the critical sections followed with a frantic precision. They were holding. The concentrated patching was doing its job, but the strain remained visible. Stress indicators appeared as faint white discoloration of the silicate, where the molecular bonds were being stretched to their absolute limit. The entire morning was spent reinforcing those boundaries. The work proceeded at a pace that left lungs burning in the thin and recycled air. The inventory of compound burned through at a rate that was physically painful to watch. Every kilogram squeezed into a seam was another hour of life stolen from the future. Breakfast was skipped in favor of working straight through the midday. Relief only came when a specific high-density patch required a pure weight. This left Ian standing on his ladder with nothing but the silence. During one of those waits, the top rung became a seat while gloved hands rested on knees. The view through the clear silicate showed the lunar surface. The sun was low and cast impossibly long obsidian shadows across the regolith. Above it, the sky was an absolute and suffocating black. Thoughts turned to the crest line. The ship was likely sitting in a dry dock or a high-orbit staging area while being surrounded by technicians and bureaucrats. Those people were currently debating fuel loads and crew availability and budget approvals. To them, Outpost 656 was a line item on a spreadsheet. It was a liability that needed to be managed with the least amount of fiscal impact. The descent from the ladder happened the moment the cure timer on the wrist buzzed. The midday communication window opened while Ian was still covered in gray dust. No effort was made to clean up. Work gloves were stripped off just before opening the channel. Stella's coordinator led with a voice practiced in its optimism. He reported that the Crestline departure was officially confirmed. A launch window in approximately 3 days was the current estimate. Ian did not smile. A notepad was grabbed instead. The coordinator was told to provide the exact launch time and the projected burn trajectory. The numbers were provided and written down with a hand that was heavy on the pen. 9 to 10 days for transit was the requirement. Added to the 3-day launch window, that put the arrival at 12 or 13 days from now at a minimum. Ian looked up at the boundary reinforcements he had just applied. The gray compound was still wet and glistening under the bay lights. Nothing was said about what 12 days meant. The dome manufacturer's technical representative cut in with a voice more clinical than the coordinators. He asked for the updated assessment. The details were provided with the cold and surgical accuracy of a man who had no reason to lie. The report covered the cascade event and the visible gaps and the boundary stress. When the technical brief finished, the silence on the other end lasted for a long time. The technical voice finally spoke and dropped the corporate mask. He stated that based on the progression data and the visual confirmation, the dome had entered terminal progression. The damage reached a threshold where the structural failure was now self-reinforcing. He noted that every crack fixed was just shifting the load to a weaker point. Ian told the man to tell him something he did not know. Another pause followed. The voice claimed their internal modeling suggested the dome had between 4 and 7 days of meaningful structural integrity remaining. Ian asked for a definition of meaningful. The voice replied that it meant integrity sufficient to maintain a pressurized environment. He stated that after that, a rapid decompression event was anticipated. The window was closed before Stellar could add a postscript about holding on. Ian sat in the silence of the communications room and looked at the numbers on the pad. 4 to 7 days of air. 13 days for a ship. It was a simple subtraction problem that resulted in a negative number. Work resumed because there was nothing else to do. Stopping meant sitting with the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was a death sentence. The body was pushed through the afternoon and into the evening. Hands were shaking so badly that tools eventually had to be strapped to the wrists to keep them from dropping. The labor only stopped when a section of sealant was misapplied, so badly it required a 30-minute cleanup. Dinner was ignored. A cold ration pack was eaten standing up in the maintenance bay, with eyes fixed on the blueprints of the rover. After eating, a full and redundant systems check of the rover bay was performed. Oxygen scrubbers and battery arrays and emergency sealants were all verified. A moment was spent standing by the hull with a hand resting on the cold and thermal-wrapped metal. It was the only thing on the base that was not groaning. The evening communication window at 21:00 was more of the same. Stellar remained upbeat and insisted that the crestline was a guarantee. Ian demanded the ship's current coordinates. The numbers were given and punched into the lunar tracking terminal. The crestline was real, and it was where they claimed it was. But when the transit time was calculated based on its current vector, the result flashed on the screen. It read 11 days and 14 hours. The number had gone up. The channel was reopened with a voice that was tight. A question was asked about why the transit time had increased. The coordinator explained that it was trajectory optimization for fuel efficiency. He claimed it was a standard adjustment for heavy salvage vessels. Ian understood perfectly. They were taking the long way to save money on the burn. They were betting his life against a fuel bill. The channel was closed and an hour was spent sitting at the terminal. The tiny green pixel of the ship crawled across the display. Finally, a return to the quarters followed. Ian lay on the bunk fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep did not come for a long time. When it finally arrived, it was a heavy and exhausted stupor that felt more like a blackout than rest. A sound different from the groan caused an awakening several hours later. It was a sharp and high-pitched ping. A structural bolt had sheared under tension. Ian got up and headed toward the dome in the dark. The arithmetic of the 4-day gap was screaming in his head. The catastrophic failure at the third impact site signaled the definitive end of the maintenance phase. Upon reaching the dome, Ian discovered that his primary keystone patch had undergone a full delamination. The massive sheet of synthetic rubber had separated from the silicate surface entirely. It hung loose in the dim emergency, lighting like a strip of dead skin, flapping in a phantom draft that should not have existed. This was not the manageable edge lifting of previous days. Instead, the structure was finally rejecting the repair with a cold, chemical finality. The silicate beneath the failed patch looked raw and jagged. The cracks beneath it had widened into dark, hungry maws that seemed to swallow the light from his lamp. A long minute passed as Ian stood at the base of his ladder, looking at the hanging patch. No curses followed the discovery. Instead, the heavy ladder and the crates of materials were retrieved for one final, desperate effort. The work began in the absolute dark of the base's night cycle to avoid waiting for the internal timers to cycle the lighting up. The entire world was reduced to a sharp and narrow circle of white light from a helmet lamp. Scraping away frozen, crystallized compound and rebonding the heavy sheets made the repair brutal and clumsy. 3 hours of labor consumed more material than the total allocation for an entire day of operations. Survival dictated the use of high-viscosity sealant, originally reserved for a total hull breach event. His hands were shaking from the creeping cold, because the thermal regulators were clearly losing their battle against the lunar night, but he forced them to be steady. Every centimeter of the seam was pressed into place with bruised thumbs until the molecular bond took hold. Once the last seam was pressed flat and verified, a full perimeter walk followed. Every meter of the silicate hemisphere was checked under the slow, scanning movement of the helmet light. 2 more areas of significant new tracking appeared in the abandoned sections during this sweep. These fractures had propagated overnight to reach the very boundaries of the maintained zones. Shifting loads from the failing dome were already testing the reinforcements applied only yesterday. The unmanaged sections were now physically pulling on the patches meant to save the core. It was a tug of war between the dying structure and the man trying to hold the center together. Ian could hear the silicate screaming. It was a high-pitched, crystalline sound that traveled through the soles of his boots. Reinforcing those boundaries cost more material and more of a dwindling physical stamina. When the work finally ended, the center of the dome floor became a temporary resting place. A final and honest accounting of supplies took place in the cold light of the lamp. Perhaps 2 days of patching capacity remained in the crates. The optimistic calculation of 4 or 5 days from earlier in the week was gone. 48 hours was the new reality. Even that window would vanish if the cascade continued at the accelerated rate observed over the last 6 hours. The numbers went into the log with the same mechanical precision applied to every entry since day 1. Then came the trip to the communication room for the morning window. The arrival was earlier than usual because sleep had been impossible since the middle of the night. Stella's coordinator led with a standard, scripted opening. Updates on the press landing confirmation of the launch window were provided with a nauseating cheerfulness. An estimated transit time of 11 days suggested everything was on track from a corporate perspective. Ian listened to the entire report without interrupting. When the voice finally finished, the response was calm and precise. The dome had approximately 48 hours of structural integrity remaining. The evidence was found in the last night of progression and the hard inventory of the materials. Absolute silence followed the statement. The stellar senior voice finally took over the channel. This was the voice Ian had not heard in several days. The severity of the situation had clearly bumped the status back up the chain of command. A request for confirmation of the assessment followed. Ian did more than confirm the numbers. Specific data points regarding patch failure rates and boundary stress were added to the record with the clinical detachment of a coroner. The manufacturer's own assessment of 4 to 7 days was noted as being 4 days out of date and functionally useless. More silence followed. The senior voice requested that Ian stay on hold while they consulted with the technical teams. 11 minutes passed on the wall clock while the second hand swept with a rhythmic click that felt like a countdown to decompression. The senior voice returned alongside the dome manufacturer's technical representative and a new director. This man identified himself as a senior technical director and launched into very specific structural questions about the delamination and the crack intersections in the third quadrant. Every answer was provided with the accuracy of a man who had been documenting his own survival for 2 weeks. A moment of heavy quiet followed the technical exchange. The director then stated that they concurred with the assessment. The dome's remaining integrity window was limited and likely terminal. Preparation for contingency survival measures was ordered immediately. This was the first explicit acknowledgement from either company that survival might occur without the dome. A request for specific recommended measures followed. The director suggested any sealed and pressurized environment on the base that functioned independently of the dome structure. The rovers, Ian stated. The director confirmed the choice. News followed that the rover was already prepared and had been for several days. Ian did not mention that he had been stealing supplies for the vehicle in secret. A shorter silence followed before the stellar senior voice returned. The Crestline departure was being moved up. A launch within 24 hours was planned now that the situation was fully clarified. The new transit time was given as 10 days, or possibly 9, with a more direct and fuel-heavy trajectory. The math remained simple and brutal. 24 hours to launch plus 9 to 10 days of transit put rescue at least 10 days away. The dome had 48 hours of life left. The rover was no longer a backup plan or a paranoid contingency. It was the only plan. Stellar was asked directly what the expectation was for the intervening gap. The senior voice claimed the rover would provide the necessary survival window to bridge the time. He insisted the Crestline would reach the site in time as long as Ian managed his resources effectively. The question was repeated for clarity. The company was telling a man to abandon the base and live in a 4-meter box for 10 days on the surface of a dead world. Stellar's voice recommended the use of all available survival resources. He noted that the ship was on its way and that the situation was a priority. A 10-day stay in a rover rated for 8 to 10 days with supplementary supplies was a narrow margin, but the voice expressed every confidence in the ability of a veteran maintenance man to bridge that gap. Ian thanked them and closed the window. A long time was spent looking at the blank wall of the communications room. Then came one more full perimeter walk of the dome. This was the last proper inspection. Patches applied over nearly 2 weeks were touched by hand and checked by eye. Several of the boundary reinforcements already showed the early stress indicators of white discoloration. Within 24 hours, the majority of them would be failing as the abandoned sections collapsed. Standing in the middle of the dome floor, Ian looked up at the cathedral of his own making. The whole damaged and cracked surface was visible above, a crude geometry of gray compound and silver tape. The work of 2 weeks was written in every square meter of the silicate. Everything a maintenance man could do with available materials had been done. There was nothing left to patch. The path led underground. The base was walked one last time. Tables in the cafeteria remained bolted to the floor, waiting for a crew that was not coming. Equipment in the lab spaces sat in standby mode, with status lights blinking in the dark like the eyes of small animals. In the quarters, personal items were stripped down to what would fit in suit pockets. A notepad and a single physical photograph of the rotation crew were taken. The bunk was left behind without a second glance. Back in the communications room, the automated distress beacon was set to a continuous broadcast on the emergency frequency. The gain was adjusted to maximum. Transmission of position and situation data would continue regardless of the dome's fate. A final log entry was updated with everything documented from the first impact to the final delamination. The file was transmitted to Stellar, and the progress bar for the upload finally filled the screen. The suit bay was the final stop. Every check was run twice. Seals on the wrists and O-rings on the neck ring were verified with a slow, practiced hand. The process followed the training and the rigid habits of a 40-year career. The helmet was tucked under an arm for the walk to the rover bay. Above, the sound of the structure continued to groan like a dying animal, but the maintenance man did not look back. The rover bay was a tomb of recycled air and shadows, disconnected from the groaning respiratory system of the dome above. Ian stood by the hatch for a long moment, his gloved hand resting on the rugged, thermal-wrapped hull of the vehicle. He had been quietly preparing this machine for 3 days, a secret betrayal of his duty to the structure that felt like an admission of defeat. The supplies were loaded. The systems were checked. It sat positioned and ready, facing the exit airlock as if it had known this moment was inevitable long before he had admitted it to himself. He performed a final systems check. His movements were slow and steady, governed by the same internal rhythm that had guided every checklist of his 43-year working life. Life support nominal. Power 100%. Navigation calibrated. Communications active. Emergency equipment and supply inventory verified. Everything checked out. The machine was ready to be his world, a 4-meter pressurized box that would either be his salvation or his final resting place. Ian pulled his helmet on. The seal engaged with a metallic clack that cut off the ambient sound of the bay, replaced by the mechanical whir of his suit's life support. He ran his suit check with a practiced eye, pressure nominal, oxygen flow steady, comms linked to the rover established. He climbed into the cabin and sealed the heavy inner door. Inside, the rover's internal atmosphere stabilized almost instantly. Pressure, oxygen, and temperature hit their marks. He cut the ignition. The rover hummed to life beneath him, a quiet, reassuring vibration that felt more honest than the groaning silicate of the base. Using the internal panel, he triggered the airlock. He watched the massive outer door cycle open, sliding back to reveal the lunar surface. The absolute, unblinking black of space was visible through the exit, framed by the jagged edge of the crater wall. The maintenance man shifted into drive. He moved the rover forward slowly, feeling the transition as the wheels left the smooth base floor and bit into the fine, clingy lunar regolith. The vehicle lurched, its suspension complaining as it adjusted to the uneven terrain. He cleared the airlock and drove out onto the lunar surface proper for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. He didn't drive fast. There was no reason to. Whatever was going to happen was already in motion, and speed would not alter the arrival of the ship or the departure of his heir. He steered the vehicle approximately 2 kilometers out across the gray, dusty plain and stopped. He turned the rover in a slow, wide arc until the dome was centered in his forward viewport. He killed the drive systems, cut the exterior lights, and just sat. From this distance, the dome filled the frame. It looked smaller than it had from the inside, a fragile bubble of light pinned against the dark. He could see the impact sites clearly, 4 dark, scarred wounds on the hemisphere's skin. Between them, the low-angle sunlight caught the ridges of his work. The dark lines of the patches stood out in sharp relief, a crude and determined geometry of gray compound and silver tape. He could also see the abandoned sections. They looked like maps of a broken country. Dark lines that had been microscopic hairlines were now visible gaps, spreading across the surface in search of the critical quadrants. Ian opened the rover's communication system and tuned it to the emergency frequency. The base's automated beacon came through immediately, a steady, rhythmic pulse sending his own log data out into the void in a continuous cycle. He opened a voice channel to Stellar International. Outpost 656, Ian reported. His voice was calm, mirroring the silence of the cabin. I am at my transition point. Position 2 kilometers northwest of the primary airlock. Rover systems nominal. All supplies aboard. Dome integrity is visually deteriorating. Awaiting the Kreslin. The stellar voice that returned was professional, rehearsed, and distant. We copy your position, Ian. The Kreslin is on track. Everything is proceeding according to the repair and recovery schedule. You just need to hold on. Ian acknowledged the transmission. He sent his telemetry data for their records and closed the voice channel, but he left the frequency open so he could hear the beacon. He performed his first rover resource check. Oxygen levels, water, rations, power. He logged the baseline numbers on a fresh sheet of the notepad. He would check them again in 6 hours. He would check them every 6 hours until the ship arrived, where the air ran out. The days that followed were a slow exercise in the physics of depletion. Ian sat in the seat, adjusting the lumbar support and the harness until he found a position he could live in. He rested his hands in his lap and looked out at the dome. By the 3rd day in the rover, the math began to turn against him. He had emptied the cafeteria and the supply lockers of what he could carry, but the rover's life support was designed for excursions, not long-term habitation. The CO2 scrubbers were the first to show the strain. The air in the small cabin grew thick and metallic, a taste he had learned to associate with failing systems. He found himself staring at the dome, his eyes tracing the path back to the airlock. He thought about the storage levels deep beneath the lunar surface. There were more canisters there. There was more water. But the dome above those stairs was no longer a structure, it was a deadfall. On the 5th day, he watched a secondary fracture in an abandoned quadrant give way. A section of silicate the size of a transport truck slumped inward, shattering into 1,000 crystalline shards that caught the sun like diamonds. The vibration reached the rover as a faint, ghostly thud through the regolith. To go back in for supplies was a gamble where the house held all the cards. If the dome collapsed while he was inside, there would be no escape. The airlock would warp, the ceiling would pancake, and he would be buried in the very material he had spent 40 years maintaining. He stayed in the rover. He cut his rations in half. He lowered the cabin temperature to conserve power, huddled in his suit as the frost began to bloom on the edges of the viewport. The realization sat heavy in his gut that the Crestland wasn't a rescue ship. It was a repair vessel. It wasn't burning its engines hot to save a man. It was cruising at an optimized, fuel-efficient speed to save a structure. To Stellar and the manufacturer, the dome was the asset. Ian was just a temporary biological component that had stayed behind to minimize the damage. They weren't coming for him, they were coming for the 4 scarred impact sites he had kept from failing. By the 9th day, the 4-day gap had arrived. His oxygen was a sliver of red on the gauge. The water recycler was humming a wet, broken tune. He sat in the dim emergency lighting of the cabin, his breathing shallow to keep the CO2 levels from spiking. He looked at the dome through the frost. It was a skeleton now. Most of the non-critical sections had collapsed, leaving only the 4 quadrants Ian had reinforced. They stood like pillars, holding up a jagged crown of broken silicate. His patches, the gray, ugly work of 2 weeks, were the only things still keeping the interior pressurized. The rotation ship that had left early stayed in his mind, the crew's departure a scene from a different life. Their normalcy felt impossible now. Moving supplies to the rover bay 3 days before telling a soul hadn't been an accident. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the math he'd done long before Stellar did. The company was always going to value the glass more than the man, and he'd known it the moment he picked up the first roll of tape. On the 12th day, the rover sat 2 kilometers out in the dark, a silent silhouette against the regolith. It did not move, and no light came from the viewport when a new glow finally appeared in the black sky. The Crestline descended on a column of cold fire. It didn't land near the rover. It didn't pulse its lights in a greeting. It touched down a kilometer away from the dome, positioning itself for the easiest access to the repair sites. The ship was a massive, industrial beast, its hull emblazoned with the logos of the manufacturer and Stellar International. Floodlights snapped on from the ship's gantry, slicing through the lunar dark. They didn't sweep the horizon for a survivor. They hit the dome. The powerful beams illuminated the wreckage, reflecting off the gray patches and the silver tape Ian had applied with such desperation. Mechanical arms began to deploy from the ship's hold, carrying heavy structural reinforcement plates and industrial-grade sealants. The repair team was already at work, their sensors scanning the silicate for integrity, their comms filled with technical data about load-bearing quadrants. 2 kilometers away, the rover sat as a dark, silent shape in the long shadows of the lunar dusk. Its exterior was coated in a fine layer of gray dust, making it nearly invisible against the regolith. There were no lights in the viewport. No signal came from the high-gain antenna. On the emergency frequency, the base beacon gave one final, distorted chirp and went silent as the dome's primary power finally failed, plunging the interior into the same cold vacuum that waited outside. The Crestline's crew moved with efficient precision. They moved toward the prize, their lights dancing over the gray scars Ian had left behind. They were there to save the guarantee. In the absolute crushing quiet of the moon, the rover remained a still, unmoving silhouette in the distance. Whether the man inside was watching them or had long since stopped breathing was a question the repair ship had not yet stopped to ask. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story. And if you want to support the show, leaving a review on your favorite podcast app really helps us grow. Hope to see you next time.